Hi guys, my name's Manas. I'm the CEO of London Politica, and today I'm speaking to Caspian Conran, who's a political economist at Baringa Partners. And we're talking about the ongoing situation in Kazakhstan. This is something that's been all over the headlines for the last 2 weeks. Caspian, could you start off by just giving us a quick sort of bird's eye view of the situation?
Yeah, so I think one of the reasons we've been interested in what's going on in Kazakhstan is this destabilization, these so-called protests. Some call it pro-democracy, some talk it fuel protests. Obviously, the administration in Kazakhstan like to call it sort of destabilization by terrorist groups. But whatever you want to look at it, the reality has been we've had a week of protests that escalated with a request from the incumbent regime for Russian military support through a sort of Soviet era NATO system. And effectively that's dampened the protests, and now the regime is in full control. It felt like that was being driven by popular discontent across economic issues, specifically relating to fuel prices, LPG, which is a form of gas. But almost the wider implications are potentially what's more interesting in some respects, Manus. And I think that's the bit that we want to get into in terms of what are the consequences of that.
Right. I mean, it's more than just the fuel prices, right? Because that sort of the immediate demands of protesters, I believe, were reversed immediately. But the discontent still sort of continued, and I think there's a broader kind of social sense of Kazakhstan's a country where all this gas and oil sort of transits through. It has an oligarchical sort of class of people that have gotten rich off the former Soviet Union, of these sort of energy prices, and yet the common people are still expected to up the sort of fuel prices for that. So I think
for sure. I think common view is 30 years after the fall of the Soviet Union, what has changed?
Yeah.
And that's the common challenge for all of those Soviet states, right? Is that in many respects, Soviet era oligarchic systems have continued to perpetuate, and that's causing a lot of problems, whether it be in Belarus or Kazakhstan.
Sure. And it's coming in at a really interesting time, I think, because we're already thinking about the former Soviet Union, weeks before when the situation on the Ukrainian-Russian border was unfolding, Russia sort of amassing tons and tons of troops, the West not very happy about that. I'm wondering how you think that sort of changes Putin's calculus around that situation, because it seems to me like there's two sort of dominant views from the analysts I've read about. One is that Putin's going to look at this. He's going to look at it as a big win. He's won. He's legitimized himself in putting over troops in Kazakhstan, and that's going to embolden him to further possibly push into Ukraine, amass more troops, and to keep that pressure on the West. But the other argument is, maybe because of this, he's had to divert troops, he's had to divert resources, he's possibly in a weaker position. He can't keep the troops up there forever. And that sort of inertia might get him, and this is possibly a win for the West as a distraction for Putin. What's your view on the situation?
Yeah, hugely. And just to remind everyone why this is so important, and especially for our clients, we sit in a world where Russian pipeline gas remains about 20 to 30% below in volume terms 2019. And that's causing huge shortages of gas, not just in Europe, but in wholesale markets globally. LNG, liquefied natural gas, is coming over from other parts of the world, especially the US, to try to compensate that. But energy prices are 300, 400% up in wholesale markets. So it's really important what's happening in Ukraine through those transit routes, which is one of the main pipeline sources to Central Europe. Clearly, Putin's calculus is twofold. He's going to try to cause economic pain as a way of securing leverage for his wider aims. And this military build-up is one of his other cards, if you like, and he's trying to put both cards down on the table at the same time. So that's the context of why I think we should talk about it and why it's important. My suggestion, when you put those two arguments forward, I veer more towards the former. I think that this was a risk for Putin. Another so-called color revolution on his doorstep certainly would have emboldened, the West to really start looking and suggesting, well, is this edifice actually really pretty hollow? It doesn't take much for some of these regimes to collapse. So I think Putin's calculus was pretty effective, that he moved in quite hard and fast to support the administration in Kazakhstan. And my kind of interpretation is actually that's been very successful. And he comes out of this week actually emboldened, strengthened. He's domestically popular at home. He's demonstrated his military capability, and he's also shored up a strong ally to his eastern flank. So, I would say going into these negotiations with NATO, Putin can be quite comfortable that he's flexed and demonstrated his capabilities. So I don't think it's fully changed the calculus. It was a risk, but he seems to have gotten away with it.
Right. And one country we haven't mentioned so far is China, who's eagerly, I'm sure, watching the situation, although hasn't seemed to be nearly as interventionist yet as Russia has. And of course, China has sort of plenty of strategic assets. They get, substantial, not a massive, but a substantial amount of their gas through Kazakhstan. And also we well know isn't a fan of any sort of social instability around his country. How do you think China is viewing the situation, and what do you think China makes of Russia's intervention?
Yeah, well, I think you said that the main point, about 25% of Chinese pipeline gas comes through Kazakhstan. I think a few people underestimated the significance at the beginning because Kazakhstan as a source of gas is relatively small for China, about 5 BCM, about less than 5% of Chinese consumption. But it's a major transit country, just like Ukraine. So there's huge pipeline assets in Kazakhstan that if there was disruption or they fell into the wrong hands or the regime changed and the tariffs and taxes changed, that could really start to hurt Chinese interests. So certainly China was very acutely aware and concerned of what was going on. But I think it's also in the context of this thawing of relationships between China and Russia. Of course, originally during the Cold War, there was the so-called Sino-Soviet alliance, this meeting of ideological minds. And we know that that's definitely no longer the case. Russia and modern China, politically, ideologically, actually don't have a lot in common. But there is this thawing of relationships, again, that people point to as saying, well, is this a sort of a rejuvenation of that old alliance? And I think in many respects, this demonstrates for China the value of Russia. Russia is a small economy. It's definitely not the senior partner in this relationship anymore. It's a small economy of limited economic interests, but politically and militarily, I think Russia has demonstrated to China the value of Russia, stabilizing its near abroad, and also offering China diplomatic cover. We know that China doesn't want to get its hands dirty, if you like. It doesn't want to send troops in to secure different regions of the world because it's acutely aware of its interests, most notably in Taiwan and Hong Kong. And so I think that Russia is demonstrating to China that it can be a useful ally in the north to stabilize those northern regions, and probably as two authoritarian countries that don't necessarily believe in the post-war liberal deterministic autonomy that we've kind of lived under, they could provide diplomatic cover for Taiwan. So I think actually this was a really important moment for the Russian-Chinese relationship.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting how that's evolved the last couple of years, because I remember when the Belt and Road investment projects were sort of at their height, and we saw these investments in Central Asia. Lots of analysts were asking, how does Russia think about this? And maybe, it's time for Russia to compete possibly with China and sort of have their own dig at it. But it seems like it's evolving more into a situation where they don't want to be competitors, and rather they want to help sort of buttress each other and kind of consolidate the region for its assets, which is quite interesting. I'm also wondering how you feel like this sort of plays into the broader context of fuel prices fueling geopolitical instability.
Yeah, I mean, I think we've got a long road ahead, and the real question, at least in the immediate crisis, is who blinks first. We know that the Russian economy is heavily dependent on those petrodollars or gas dollars, if you like, and so we know that this situation can't last forever, that at some point Russia is going to have to return significant pipeline volumes to Europe. And this really then goes back to the question of, well, what does Putin want? And is that reasonable? There's two schools of thought here. Putin's actually been quite clear, or Moscow's been quite clear about what they want in terms of their demands on NATO expansion, the removal of medium ballistic missile capability, the reduction of NATO expansion, strong legal commitments to stop NATO expansion. But he also knows that NATO have been quite clear that that's not going to happen. So there's two schools of thought here. One is that this is a genuine negotiation in which Russia really hopes to kind of push back the post-Cold War encroachment onto its near abroad. Or the other interpretation is this is a significant escalation of rhetoric in order to secure a pretext for a partial or full takeover of Ukraine, partial Russian-speaking eastern elements of Ukraine, full maybe even all the way to Kiev. And to be honest, I don't know if you've heard anyone, but I think people are genuinely, even in the US State Department and NATO, still not really sure of the calculation of what is Putin trying to achieve here, and is he an honest broker in this negotiation with NATO?
Yeah, I think I'm of the view that the latter, sort of interpretation of that is 100% the right one. I mean, if you look at the sort of demands he put forward in these bilateral negotiations, it was, Ukraine can never be part of NATO. America needs to reduce its sort of footprint in its sort of Eastern European countries. And that's, that's commitment everyone knows that NATO or America would never make, because it would completely sort of lose popular support. It would be a clear, lose-lose for Biden. It just would make no sense. I really think it was more of a, pretense for Putin to say, hey, we went out there, we tried to negotiate, we put out our demands and it didn't work. So here we are being more militaristic because we've got to stand up for our national interests.
But look, I mean, this is, whether that's true or not, there's clearly context here, right? And precedent with Georgia, with Crimea, so with Kazakhstan. So this is clearly a regime that is prepared to use its military capabilities. Whether the cost-benefit analysis, if you like, of the economic and political reprisals or consequences of this necessarily stack up, I remain dubious of that. But as we know in recent years, often political and military events don't necessarily follow a particular logic, and it is certainly a febrile situation.
Sure. That was some fantastic analysis, Caspian. Any kind of last parting thoughts on that? What to watch out for next?
Yeah, I think that the big one also is the approval of Nord Stream 2, which we've been watching, and to see whether that helps Putin de-escalate, right? I think a lot of people are wanting to give Moscow a way of backing down. I wouldn't be shocked that Nord Stream 2's approval is part of a de-escalation process in this, and that's in May.
Okay. Now, plenty of things to come. Caspian, thank you so much for your time and brilliant insight. Always very helpful.
Thank you.